Let me just scoot over in front of the mic. Hi, how are y'all doing? So yeah, this is my first time giving the talk. My name is Drew Powers. I've been building websites and web-based software for 15 to 17 years professionally, depending on how low you set the bar for the word professional. The title of this talk just came from this ancient book that just popped into my head. Given the events the last 2 weeks, and I don't feel like talking about, I'll probably rename the talk if I give it. So just don't think too hard about the title. But this is my journey. I'm giving this talk because I've had experience like creating or maintaining a few popular open source projects like Astro over the years. Just wanted to share my perspective on why I think contributing to open source is valuable, how to get started, how I kind of stumbled into it, and keep stumbling into it like Sideshow Bob in a parking lot full of rakes. We can kind of, and the way I kind of structured this talk too, please feel free to like kind of raise your hand and interrupt me and ask questions, because I might just kind of blow right by something that you might be interested in, and so yeah, just stop me if you want me to elaborate on something, because I don't have time to cover everything, and that would be cruel to y'all to hold you captive for much longer. So yeah, just show of hands, we did the hiring thing earlier, but like how many of you are like new to the industry or are like on their first job or applying to their first job? A couple people? Okay, cool. How many people have contributed to open source in any capacity, opening an issue? Oh, awesome, yeah, a lot of you. Opening issues counts. Opening issues is valuable. We'll get to that. You're an open source contributor if you open an issue. So yeah, people kind of come into it with different backgrounds, and even whether you're new to the industry or you've been working in the industry for years, sometimes you can come in, people like who have been like seniors, like just don't have a complete view of open source or kind of missing some of the huge opportunities that open source can offer. This talk's kind of structured into like, number one, just a brief overview of what is open source, why to contribute, kind of talk through my journey, which is like more anecdotal, less how you should do it, just more this is a thing that happened to a person. And there are so many stories and experiences, but just like, take with a grain of salt, maybe it's helpful, and your journey will likely look different, but it's just a data point to compare to other people's journeys and stories. And then lastly, I'll kind of get into like some practical advice of like how you too can contribute to open source. Question one, what is open source? Kind of goes back to the 1970s, goes back to pre-internet days, to like the days of like the MIT Computer Lab and like Harvard Computer Research, artificial intelligence, and open source can be so many things. Open source powers the internet from like the raw protocols we use. It can power public transit. Little known fact is like a lot of, if you're in New York, if you're navigating the subway and see estimated subway times, those are operating off of open source standards. It powers creativity, like some of the most powerful creative tools, from Blender to Krita Painter, are all open source. And it powers information. Like we have one of the largest digital archives of human history, the Internet Archive, which is amazing. And if you have a chance to go to San Francisco, they keep the servers in an old church because like the really thick stone walls are like natural like server coolants. It's really cool. Also really scary that like so much information could be wiped out if like a fire started in that building. But I digress. More things are open source than most people realize, and it powers tech. According to Harvard Business School, $9 trillion of value generated for corporations from open source. 95% of businesses in the IT sector rely on open source, and the 9 trillion is a big number, and it's not the dollar amount that matters. It's more just expressing like importance, because if I say open source is important, you might think of it as just like, oh yeah, it's important, like recycling is important, I know I'm supposed to do it, it makes Sesame Street characters happy if I do it, but then it might end up in a landfill anyways, but I know I'm supposed to do it. But it's like actual economies depend on this, like actual international trade depends on open source, like the internet depends on open source, like it constitutes the fabric of like modern technology, so a lot of stuff depends on open source. And more than just like the technology, there's also a lot of community around it. The longer you open source, the more you work in open source, the longer you realize it's a much smaller world than you think it is. This screenshot is from a comedy YouTube series, Krazam. You might have seen the microservices video. And this screenshot is not directly relevant to my talk, but it makes me laugh. And it also touches on how niche and microscopic some of the OSS communities are. This is a video where he goes to a Linux conference, he's the only one there. So you have this really strange juxtaposition of like, this is like some of the most important work we can do in technology, and also the communities are really small and on the verge of extinction at any given moment. It's a really fun juxtaposition. So one such example, this is one example that happened in March of 2024. There is a open source project called XZ, which I don't use directly. I think it relates to something to do with like SSH, and a lot of like a lot of programs rely on this, and it's just it was largely just maintained by like an unpaid, overworked OSS maintainer, and it basically just got caught by accident, and it would have been one of like the largest breaches in software history, if not the largest, and was like almost on the verge of being breached, and someone accidentally stumbled across a 500 millisecond delay and looked into it and saved the internet. And a lot of people have seen this XKCD comic of how modern infrastructure can be held up by just this one little pin, and the XZ, this example got brought up a lot in like the XZ attack. And it's not untrue, sadly. A lot of open source work is unpaid, and there's a lot of responsibility relying on few resources. You know, despite major attacks like this or really close calls, like the fabric of open source hasn't really changed. And it's a bit of an unsolved problem at the moment, because if you just say, well, let's just pay these open source maintainers, let's introduce money into it, then you have the problem of corporate funding and corporate interests. And we'll kind of touch on that in the next slide. So like backing up a bit, there's kind of like a long-standing debate as to the origins of open source and what is open source, what isn't open source. If you look into it, you'll probably see two names come up a lot. One is Richard Altman, the other is Tim O'Reilly. And some part of it is interesting, like dealing with like AI research and this idea that by sharing information we can advance technology and society as a result. It came from a lot of academic settings where just sharing information, like a famous story is like I switch the MIT AI research and the Harvard computer lab all the time in my brain because I heard those stories simultaneously. So if I mess it up, forgive me. But in the MIT research lab, they would just like have open emails. Like people would just read each other's emails and respond to other emails, because like it was so open, like even email wasn't off limits, and not in a nefarious way. Everyone was spying on each other. It was just an area of trust and advancement. And when someone was asked, well, why are you reading each other's emails? Like, well, they get an answer faster. Like, I was in the computer lab, I saw an email, and that person got sped up because of the sharing, because of all open doors and transparency. And so that spirit kind of carried into, Richard Altman founded the Free Software Foundation, and outlined the principles of freedom, of trying to create equitable societies by sharing information. He's aligned himself with luminaries like Linus Torvalds of Linux fame, and Richard Altman is really is also as concerned as like outlining what is not open source as what is open source. And Tim O'Reilly, coming from like Berkeley academia, had put less restrictions on gatekeeping open source and what is and what isn't open source. Overall, like it's not that these are like two mortal enemies that are like fighting, but I think they kind of represent two competing ideas of open source. One is very concerned about like the textbook examples of freedom and libre and gratis, and they'll define all these terms and they'll say it has to be this, it can't be this. If it's this, it's not open source, and there's a lot of black and white restrictions around it. And the other idea is just open source is just the idea of sharing. It's not really concerned about what it's not. If you're sharing for the purposes of improving other people's lives, that is open source, and there's not a lot of caveats to it. And kind of paint a picture like this does come up in licensing a lot. We have open source, we have free and open source, we have FLOSS, which I forgot what it stands for, and these little ring of licenses outline what your project can and cannot be used for. So I know Stephen just shared his project. Stephen's still here? Yeah. Oh, there you are. Like, what do you have an open source license on Blueprint?
Yeah, I think I'm using MIT.
Awesome. Okay, yeah, so that's an open license. So that means if you just put the code on GitHub, we can't use it because it's not licensed, because Steven is still the full copyright owner. But putting it on GitHub and licensing it, saying you can use this for commercial and non-commercial purposes, because you can set other restrictions, and so the license really matters. And the license actually determines, or you can have something that's open source, but it's not free and open source, meaning you can look at it, but you can't, it's kind of in a weird state, but you know, one example of, yeah, licensing matters. One example of this is we can now use JS Hint for evil. If you missed this story, this was from a couple years ago. The creator of JS Hint had a really simple license that said this software should be used for good and not evil, which is like, it's really noble, it's really good. In a court of law, a lot of companies couldn't use this because their lawyers couldn't defend in court that we were a good company, because that is not the domain of the lawyers to decide. There is not a legal definition of good or evil. And so some companies actually couldn't use JS Hint because of the weird terminology of the license. So yes, the licenses are long and boring, but the terminology means like, oh, people can actually benefit from this. And you know, the end of the story is they you know, went to an MIT license, and eventually, you know, people use ESLint now more than JS Hint, and he kind of attributes this licensing gaffe as the reason why this creator was not, you know, the premier JS linter like ESLint was, which I think it started out with an MIT license, but I didn't look up the history of it. So that's kind of like a brief overview of like open source, you know, something it's been going on for decades, and yeah, ultimately just it's about sharing knowledge and ideas, and also, you know, giving people the legal power to take your ideas and run with them, and having something that's like, that they can also like take into court and said like, yeah, it's MIT license, like I use Blueprint, you know, Steven licensed to me, I can use this, and that's great. So yeah, kind of jumping into like my journey, what I've experienced in the last 8 years. My general creative process, like when it comes to open source, is like a bit of a roller coaster. I fluctuate between thinking I'm smart and I'm an idiot, often simultaneously. So if I'm able to call myself an open source developer, you know, and if you have doubts too, you're in good company. There's plenty of room here. And often I think the best contributors to open source have at least a little bit of doubt, a little bit of humility, because it makes you a better listener. It makes you more open to ideas, and that's the whole idea of open source, is sharing, giving and getting input. But if I had also had to simplify my process into like one driving force, I think it would be annoyance. I find there's a direct correlation with how annoyed I am with something and how much time I spend trying to make that problem go away. So the more time I spend trying to fix my annoyance, usually the more time I meet other annoyed people who, with our forces combined, can wipe out this really annoying thing that all of us have been plagued by individually, but collectively we can fix it. And open source is a great way to build a community around, you know, that common enemy of a problem that annoys you all very, very, very much. It's wonderful. So a couple projects I've worked on, one was like an OpenAPI TypeScript, just generates TypeScript from OpenAPI schemas, like really basic, incredibly boring and dry. But this is also near and dear to my heart, because this was like the first solo project I released that got traction, still gets usage. I think also just because the more boring a problem, the more likely it is people are going to use the open source project you made, so they don't have to deal with it. And it only started because there was no thing to use. And it's been cool to see like, you know, companies like GitHub and Google pick it up, again, because of MIT licensing. And yeah, started from annoyance. And with the first project I saw that kind of got traction, there's a little bit of like a, little bit of like a downside to it, because with more usage, you know, it's cool to release code and then it's cool to see the stars go up, but then also the issues come in too, and you're like, oh, I have to reply to these people. Most of them are really nice, some of them aren't, and but most of them are nice, and most of them are very thankful for the work that you do, and usually stuff starts off with like a thank you so much for your time. But yeah, you get some stinkers in there too. And then I got to work on a bundler called Snowpack, which is not being maintained anymore, and just started from extreme annoyance with Webpack. And Webpack was in a worse place then. I'm still not the biggest fan of Webpack, truth be told, but it's a little bit better now. But that also just tells you what a mental state I was in to get so annoyed at Webpack to build my own bundler. But fortunately, I found someone else who was annoyed with the same thing, and then Fred and I worked on Snowpack for a little while. It was a really large, complex problem that neither of us had any previous experience building. But if you just kind of dive in, it's amazing how much traction you can get just from, just chipping away at a problem over time. There's also encouragement from a lot of other projects, like the Babel project. The creator had not worked with ASTs before and done a lot of complex transformations. So some of the projects that we looked to for prior art and inspiration, sometimes it was the creator's first try at that. And Snowpack was definitely definitely one of those. And so yeah, this recurring theme of also feeling cool that you got to accomplish something, and then also being crushed by the burden of maintaining it. And then I got to work on Astro. I was one of the co-creators, and we kind of sidelined Snowpack to work on Astro, and eventually switched it to Vite because it got we had to have a tough choice of with only a couple people, we really can't maintain a whole bundler and a whole static site generator. So we sent Snowpack into the wild and rolled in a lot of our ideas into Vite. So it was Vite powered from basically the release, give or take. And yeah, there's a lot of stories, a lot of fun times, a lot of hard times, a lot of scary times. It was cool to see the response of that. And more than anything, it was just it's cool to kind of catch lightning in a bottle like that and see a lot of other people rally around things that have annoyed you for years, and then you just kind of find all these people that are just oh my gosh, thank you. I've been wanting the same thing. I've been annoyed at the same thing as you. I just live in a different country and we never talked, but we were kind of living parallel lives, being annoyed at the same thing. And it's just awesome getting to have that experience over and over again through open source. I think this slide got misplaced. Where am I? Yeah, I'll come back to that slide. Yeah, and then the project I've been working on lately is not popular at all, and it's so much fun to work on. It's related to design systems and design tokens, which is also a really dry, boring subject, but for me, I just find it really interesting. I'm not really sure why, but this has kind of been my passion project for a while. Excuse me. Through the process of working on open source, it's just important to find things that bring joy to you, because often that's the only payment you get in open source. So just work on the things you want to work on. And I'm going a little fast here, so yeah, feel free to interrupt me with questions. One question is, why would I get involved in open source? You just talked about there's no money, there's no pay. Often it's a second job. Why get involved? Open source is a tricky problem to solve. There are two sides of the coin, but there are so many benefits to working on open source. There's just selfishly it provides a good challenge. I owe a lot of my skills to working on open source. Open source projects tend to sharpen my abilities in a lot of ways that a lot of professional projects don't at my day job. And then extrinsically, you get jobs from it. And yeah, people make fun of the green GitHub squares, and it's not about maxing out dark green every single day, but having a project you can claim as your own usually comes up in interviews and reflects really well. I won't say that you're guaranteed from some of the volatility that we've seen the last couple of years, but it does help for sure move your resume to the top of the stack. And then you also get that feel-good feeling of helping others, as the philosopher Joey Tribbiani describes. Something that makes you feel good turns into a selfish act, which is that whole Friends episode was really interesting. Philosophy arguing there's no such thing as a truly selfish act because it makes you feel good, so you're really doing it for yourself on some level. But you do get a feeling of helping others. And then just from like the lasting impact, the open source work you do really does have a way of advancing technology. It's just a privilege that I think sometimes I don't realize until I take a step back, that like we're living in one of the most historically significant periods in human history, like the birth of the internet, all the advancement we've seen, like the ability to talk to anybody in any other country that's connected to the internet. All of this has come about in like the last 20 years. For some of us within our lifetimes, all of this has just come out of nowhere. And like we're kind of in the like history book writing phase. A lot of the architects and designers that pulled off the system are still alive. You can go attend their talks, you can email them. It's wild. And so contributing to open source, the longer you do it, you actually can have a lasting impact on technology for the foreseeable future. And it doesn't seem like it now, but like it really adds up. So back to the main idea of how do I get started? There are a couple different starting points of how to get involved in open source. People choose their own journeys. There's different entry points. Once you get inside, you get into the house sorting hat. You're on your merry way, carving at your respective niche. But for most people, I found that there are a couple of common entry points. And even though people do reach the final stage eventually, the goal is to contribute as much as possible in between stages 4 and 5. So I'm not personally at stage 5 yet, but I can't say how close I am. And I can say I take steps in that direction, but I'm not there yet. There's still some stuff I want to build. So this is a little dark, but stages of contributing is, I've kind of found like a 4-step process that increase in order of time commitment. And you don't have to take these in order. It's just, the first step way to get involved is just opening an issue. Like, that's it. It's extremely helpful for maintainers to just have an issue, for people to report a bug that they've seen, because it's just there's not enough hours in the day for someone who maintains a project to test it on every machine, every operating system, every version of every version. Just saying, hey, I'm on this version. This is what I see. If you've, a lot of us have seen the GitHub UI. It's as simple as opening up an issue in the issue tab, but another thing that not a lot of people know about is there's a little bit small, but there's a contributing file. Usually it's in the repo itself, or it can be in the documentation, like how do I contribute? And there's a really helpful guide on how to get started, and it's written for people that have not contributed to that repo before. A lot of popular projects have it. Even though a lot of the guide is skewed towards writing code, a lot of it has to do with opening issues and reporting bugs and that sort of thing. And it has a lot of helpful info. A lot of them even have some of the I find them interesting, the notes on how the project was put together, just written for the people who are going to be working on the project, that are just kind of too boring and too detailed to go into the main documentation. But you find some really interesting things in contributors docs. Okay, that's a little small, but not too small. Like when opening an issue, they seem like basic questions, but they're really not. When opening an issue, like, am I in the right project? Meaning, I might have gotten this issue using this tool, but did I actually get the error from one of the many dependencies that this tool used? And it helps to debug a little bit, and the maintainer is also used to like really common slip-ups and really common misconceptions of, they get this error, and it might be that the larger tool, the overarching tool, has just not set it up in a meaningful way. Just doing a little bit of research and just seeing like if there's something that hints that it comes from another package, try and open it on the most specific package that you can, where you think the error came from. Also, just as simple as what format do the maintainers want, which also, like from an outsider's perspective, feels overbearing. Like, this person, like, why do they need to format my sentences in a specific way? Why do I need to have this checklist? But it really just saves time, especially when you get to the order of magnitude of literally thousands of issues that people are dealing with. It saves them so much time just being able to have a predictable format that they know how to read and follow. And different projects typically hit different common friction points too. And so the issue is set up in a way to help them triage the issues that kind of plague them the most. And blowing away that template and just writing it from scratch in paragraph form, writing 30 sentences in one giant paragraph is a way you can open an issue, but it's really hard for the maintainers to read, and they probably are not going to read it. And then also, number 3, if did I debug my issue enough? The goal is to help the maintainers fix a bug because this is open source work, and the goal is not to fix all of your IT problems. So it could be multiple errors, and if you have multiple errors, open up multiple issues. But just framing it in the sense of like, I'm trying to help this maintainer, like I am a contributor on this project and I too am trying to fix this issue for everybody. Taking that approach usually is just, it will set you up for success in opening issues and seeing them triaged. And this is a big one, providing a reproduction. I know it takes time, but open source maintainers will love you for it forever and ever. And sometimes if you provide a really good reproduction, sometimes your issue is fixed almost immediately. So it's just a really good thing to include. So to sum up, good issues have clear titles and descriptions. They have a minimal reproduction, and usually they tried to attempt a solution, or at least just kind of had some, here's some steps I tried, here's what I saw. How not to get an issue merged is, don't skip over any helpful information that might be related to you and your bug. These two have the same point. What's meant to say is lack like any diagnostic info, like missing software versions, operating system, all those things that are really helpful. Not knowing that you are on Windows is a really crucial point to like having your issue maintained. And then also just a general point, try not to pester maintainers if you don't hear back from them within 30 minutes. They're doing it for free. They need hugs and they need love and support, and usually there's an inverse correlation between the number of times you ping a maintainer and how likely they are to help fix your issue. That has happened. Not very often, but it has happened. The second way that you can contribute is by doing a docs PR. And we haven't really touched on documentation, but most really important open source projects rely on documentation, and contributing to the documentation is open source contribution. In fact, like a lot of times that is more valuable because the code can work perfectly theoretically, but a lot of developers, like, they're not reading code. Like, how many of you actually dive into the source code of any project before actually loading the doc site? I mean, maybe. Like, you will reach that, if you work to the project enough, you will dive into source code, but as a starting point, very few people dive straight into source code. They go to the documentation. So in a way, providing documentation and helping people get over common issues, a lot of issues can be solved with documentation or just a bug in the documentation, and they're all really welcome PRs. This was from a recent State of Developer Experience survey, and tech debt, always a popular one, but bad docs are one of the most common areas of developer time loss. And conversely, really popular, really good open source projects usually have good documentation. Not all of them, but most of them do. So any way that you can help make the documentation better is really valuable input. Open up documentation, PRs, fix typos, improve things. Even a huge lift is stylistic improvements. Things like there's these things called code fences. Most docs are written in Markdown, and the code fences have a language. And sometimes documentation projects don't have syntax highlighting. Either adding that or just if it's missing in one place, all that is extremely valuable for open source contributions. And usually if you open up a documentation PR, usually it'll just be thumbs up, merged right away. Some really, really simple, clear wins are correcting typos or out-of-date info, or cleaning up messy or disorganized sections. But try not to just rewrite documentation for rewrite's sake. There's a little bit of wiggle room here. If you can really make a very strong argument for the reason why you rewrote this person's documentation website, if you have a really clear good reason, a lot of times it will be considered, or at least merged, or maybe there'll be some sort of compromise where you can work together. And this doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen. And yeah, so with a lot of these guidelines, you know, it's not that I'm trying to scare you, but a lot of times when I talk to people that just haven't contributed to open source before, it comes from like not understanding what the criteria are, or you know, being scared that, you know, they're just not going to get any work accepted, and just trying to, you know, outline like it really is as simple as you know, if you can just follow the contributing guide, and if you just give them, if you follow any hints that the maintainers give you on how to set up a good issue or pull request, most of the time your work will be merged, and will be merged happily, and you'll make some friends in the process. And also, like, there's no harm in closed PRs. I open up pull requests all the time that get closed, and there's no points off. There's no record of it. It just happens. So that's the worst thing that happens, is just your pull request gets closed, but you can always open another one, and that's okay. And this kind of leads into like the big one, contributing, opening up like a code pull request that fixes a bug or adds a feature. And this can be really scary. This feels like a big milestone for a lot of people. You know, you might feel, oh, well, it's not real open source contribution until I reach this step, until I land the PR, until I have code merged, and that's not true. Like, having a good issue with a good reproduction, you are an open source maintainer. But this kind of is a milestone. It does take more time to land this pull request. And the most common thing I see when people are opening up a pull request is, you know, a lot of us work in environments where we have to look at these, these continuous integration checks, these CI checks at the bottom. Some of us are used to this, but not all of us are. A lot of us work in environments where this doesn't exist, or this is foreign, and that's okay. But for those of you that haven't had exposure to this, this is also like a really common sticking point, is people opening up pull requests and then having these all be read and then being confused why their pull request doesn't merge. And a lot of you have a good basis for this, but for the people that don't, it's the red has to be fixed, because merging in a broken state means the project is broken as a result. And so it's also a good thing to see this on a project, even though it can be frustrating to get those errors and those red X's. This is actually a really healthy project that has this, because the criteria for success is broken down into a scientific rubric. It's pass, fail. It's not if the maintainer was having a really bad day, they won't merge your PR, or if Mercury wasn't in retrograde, or whatever. It's just if you can get the green checks, then your code is going in, and your code is now part of this open source project. And just if you haven't seen this before, just clicking into details usually gives a really clear breakdown of where the error is, and it's usually because the project was guarding against a previous breakage that is just preventing users from merging your code fix and then having something broken on their end. And open source, the danger for this is, well, not that you can't do this in your day job, but for open source, for a project that gets downloaded millions of times and exists in hundreds of thousands of projects, it just amplifies into the possible number of things you can break. So you have to give maintainers a little bit of a break for being a stickler about these checks. Yeah, and just like everything else, there's usually a pull request template that asks for the pull request to be in a certain format. Usually, describing your work, having a really basic checklist for you to follow, just to make sure that your code is meeting the standards of the particular project you want to contribute to, and to make you all feel better. This is not. This is a pull request I reviewed one time. And there was a template, and this person, who shall be nameless, deleted the template, and then basically said, reorganize the code to improve readability and maintainability. It was not associated with an issue. It did not did not fix a bug, did not add a feature. Really, it was just, I rewrote your code base, and I will not explain myself. And this is what CI looked like. So merge me, please, and you can probably guess whether or not this pull request passed. So as long as you don't do anything like this, I rewrote the project, deleted all the code, and broke everything, as long as you clear that bar, you probably will get your code merged. So Yeah, this is just, in case you missed that, just in slide format, if you're reading the slides later, how not to get your PR merge one-on-one, 101. And then stepping up to like the final tier of being a project creator or a maintainer is usually happens after you've contributed to a few different code bases. If you liked contributing to a project and there's room for maintainers, then you can join an existing project. Or a lot of times you can just create a project, like Steven did, just had a problem, needed to fix it. And the good news is you don't need to start an open source project, you don't need this wellspring of inspiration and innovation, and you don't have to be a genius to do it. It's really just, there's a lot of really common, boring starting points, and it usually comes from just doing other work. You kind of stumble across an idea. Either as you're coding, you can just have an exploratory concept. I wonder if anyone has tried to go down this, or just taking two unrelated things that I wonder if we put these together. I wonder if we could have something that put React and Vue together. Is it a good idea? Probably not, but what happens? And that's okay. Like, experimentation is great. There's some really nice happy accidents that comes from things that on the surface seem dumb, but then the more you try and experiment, you actually discover something special. A really common point is just, from a need, either you're building something for a company or as a contractor, and you just need it. You just kind of fill a hole, and part of your project you realize is open source size, and so you released it. Or sometimes it can just happen accidentally. Sometimes you're not even focused on solving something, and you kind of stumble across something that's special. And this happened to me in like kind of different ways. From an idea, we built the Snowpack bundler because we were curious what happens if you just don't bundle anything. What if you just ship ESM modules to the browser, which got widespread support in around 2018, 2019. Depending on what level of support you want, it differs. And it turns out there are some problems with it still, of just shipping hundreds of JavaScript files to the browser, but there was not the tooling to try that, and at least have a data point of what some strengths and weaknesses of it were. And this would probably be way too boring to get into, but there are some advantages of shipping hundreds of JavaScript files to the browser, meaning you don't ever have the problem of like chunking, or the idea of bundle deduplication, or you basically have perfect caching just at the expense of network requests. So it was an experiment we tried, and we got some data out of it. From a need, I built some OpenAPI TypeScript tools just from working on OpenAPI at one of my jobs, and open sourcing it, just kind of throwing it online on GitHub and licensing it, and a lot of other people got a lot of use out of it, which was cool. And then Astro was started. From the other slide, it was kind of a grayed out point. Astro was started because we were trying to build a CDN, and that failed. Google Chrome killed it when they killed cross-domain resource sharing, where you couldn't get the caching benefits of loading everything from a central CDN. It'd have to be downloaded again because it's a security issue, because you can use that to trace where someone has been. The backup plan was Astro, and a lot of people like it, and so that was a really cool happy accident that kind of came out of the ashes of a failed project. And for this is where it gets more and more nebulous of how to actually start your own project, or maintain someone else's project. But GitHub community standards are like a pretty good checklist of if you're wondering how does my project, I put something on GitHub, now what? There's actually, if you click on every project has an Insights tab, and then there's a community standards tab, and there's a really good checklist of checking all of these items off actually set you up to be in a pretty good state, and the rest just kind of comes naturally as you maintain it and as people start using it and issues kind of come in. But this is a really good starting point, and like I said earlier, just making sure you have README, which is just basic documentation. All documentation starts off as a README. a license just so people can use it. I have a lot of people, ask me to review or try out their open source, but they just put it on GitHub without a license, and I can't. Or I can look at the code and review it, but you can't. No one can really use your project unless it's licensed. So this is just a really good way to set up your project for success. Regardless if it's new or existing. And the downsides of open source, it's not all fame and glory. Open source takes a lot of time. Like I said earlier, it's unpaid. Sometimes it can feel like a second job on top of your existing job. It can take a lot out of you, and it's more of a marathon than a race. I've been, if you are looking for a way to contribute, and if you TypeScript is your primary language, I could use contributors on the OpenAPI TypeScript project. Would love your help. And I had a call with someone a week ago who's in Paris who just joined as a maintainer, and was just reassuring them that it's a marathon. It's not about doing as much as possible up front, because I saw them working really late on Paris hours, putting in pull requests and wanting to do a quote unquote good job. And open source is about the marathon. And having a project that is maintained at a slower pace for 5 years is way better than having a project that's maintained for 3 months and then you burn yourself out and then you walk away from it. It benefits everyone just to take it slow. It requires tough skin. People will be really mean to you when you're not delivering the value that they want, when they're not paying you money for some reason. But those people, fortunately, you're in the minority, and there's usually an outpouring of love and support and people who are really thankful for the work that you're doing. And requires saying no, just as much as it is about maintaining the steady, slow pace of open source. It's also about setting boundaries about what the project isn't about. And oftentimes the most successful projects have really clear boundaries of, yes, this is X, but it's certainly not Y because I just don't have the time to do that. And I like going outside and touching grass. And that's really important for yourself and for the community, because you get a better project out of something that's focused and scope. So to restate some of the points I made, just kind of taking a look back at this is for the large part, this is internet history, and it started in 1996. I don't know how old people in the room are, but I was alive in 1996. So I was alive for most of internet history. There's some military stuff that happened before then, but for every standard that we've seen that has proliferated, that has kind of formed, the foundation of internet and modern life, it's all happened in the last about 20 years. So we're still in history book writing phase, and the projects that we work on now that are open sourced, they start small, and it seems like no one's paying attention, and then it can become, the next big thing, or it can become the foundation for a whole new, way of technology. React transforming the front end, and React hasn't even been out for 10 years. There's so many things that started off small that even when you look at some of the successful projects today that have millions of downloads, you think you might not be able to achieve that until you remember those only started a couple years ago with a really small team of people. And that's just how much of a need there is and how many unbuilt projects. And so it's extremely likely that a lot of people in this room today can build a project that will become foundational for the next wave of technology. So it sounds really lofty and grandiose, but it actually is. And open source is the thing that empowers it. The ability to cross boundaries and not have to exchange money, and just I give this away for free actually does, form the foundation of our technology in really major ways that I think we're not even really going to comprehend until much later from now. But it's really cool, really inspiring, and I think it's worth it. So that's it.
Any questions?
When contributing to open source, are you ever worried about, I guess, the style of code going into a repo that already exists and saying they're doing it this way, I usually do it this way. Do you ever are concerned about that, or do
Yeah, my extremely hard stance is if it's a style question, it's in linting or it doesn't matter. Like if you don't get a lint error, then it should be thumbs up. So I said that I have been if I look back, I've been guilty about saying, oh please change X or Y, but overall I've been pretty good. Those have been pretty rare. But yeah, usually it depends on the maintainer and the project for sure. But again, if you don't throw a lint error, 90% of the time, the answer is like, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I understand the natural progression of getting into it from like, you need to open an issue or like he did, you build a project because you were trying to use something. But without that, how do you like pick a project to contribute to? Are you just going for a technology, or, I mean, I've never really like needed to open up an issue, and then
Yeah.
I build personal projects for myself, but have never thought that it had complete mass appeal, so I don't really like see where I fit in necessarily.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's not an easy answer for that because oftentimes, the answer I give is just look at the projects you're using and the projects you are working on. Like actually look through your dependency list and pay attention to what you're using and just kind of learn a little bit more about each one. The tricky part is really popular, really visible open source projects have a lot of contributors and all the low-hanging fruit is gone. And so the only things that are left are extremely technical niche challenges that require you to like have in-depth knowledge of that thing. And even docs PRs are difficult because there's so many people reading the docs, they get taken up. It's usually like the medium-sized projects where it's not just one person who wrote something 8 years ago. It's like there's a couple maintainers. It's not huge downloads. There is some documentation. Those are really good projects to get your feet wet in. And if you look through your dependency list, that usually makes up most of your dependencies if you actually look through each one. I should have included this in my slides, but there's a website called OpenSauced, like pizza, SAUSCED, ran by Brian Douglas, formerly at GitHub, and it's open source analytics, but there's also some tools on there to kind of help you find ways to contribute to open source.
One more question?
A bit of a selfish question, but having just starting to get the word out about my project, how do you get people to pay attention to your project?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah, giving talks like this help. I was talking to another open source maintainer about this not too long ago, and he was, we were both kind of talking about like what does it take for an open source product to be successful to get users. And I said, I think if you just maintain a project long enough, like it'll just become successful, right? It's the projects where as developers, you want to put your trust in something that has longevity, that has gotten updates, and you actually kind of want to see that history. So it's not a fun answer, but it's realistic. Like people want to see that history of like, oh, this has been actively maintained, for 3 years. It doesn't have to be like your full-time job. It can be something every other month, right? It can be at a really trickle pace, but seeing a history of this project has being slowly built upon, so stuff that's actively maintained does well. There's, and actually the NPM algorithm actually rewards that too. When people are searching on NPM, not that everyone does, but there's the PQM, is it popularity, which I think is downloads, quality, which is some metric, I don't know how they define it, and then there's M, which is like maintenance, which is like how, at what cadence is it getting updates, like did it get one update and then it's just been stagnant for 5 years, or does this get a new like bug fix, patch release regularly? And the more you just kind of maintain it, the more the algorithm rewards that when you're searching for it on NPM. And yeah, just but my friend disagreed with me, and he he said, I don't think it's just if you do it long enough. He said, I think the reason why open source projects become successful is the maintainer quality of it. And a maintainer of an open source project doesn't just write code for it. They like pull in issues, and they're good at shepherding people through opening up pull requests, and not just kind of like taking it away from them and just doing it themselves, like actually educating people and saying, hey, here are my goals for the project, you know, doing that in pull request templates and issue templates and documentation, and, you know, as much as possible, like, more than just does the code run without errors. I think that's the lowest bar, but it's just, am I educating people like philosophically, what am I trying to achieve, and can I kind of download my brain into other people to reduce the bust factor so that someone else could actually pick up on this project if I stop contributing to it. And thinking about it more as a community project, that like magical maintainer quality, whatever it is, my friend argued like that's what makes the project successful and popular is having someone like that at the helm, or ideally multiple people like that at the helm.
All right, thank you, Drew Powers. That's it for today. Thank you for coming. We can see you back here next month.